All right, I think we'll begin. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kelly Dittmar, and I am the Director of Research at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, where I'm also an Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers-Camden. I'm also proud to be the author of CAWP's latest report, Rethinking Women's Political Power, which relies on nearly 200 interviews we conducted with political actors across 5 different states: Georgia, Illinois, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania. And we did the report to illuminate and analyze factors that shape women's access to and exercise of political power. Specifically, we looked at differences in experiences as well as obstacles and opportunities to women's power by race and ethnicity, by party, and by position. And by observing states with very different political ecosystems, we were able to contribute findings and prescriptions that we think are broadly applicable across states. So I hope you'll check out the report. It's in the chat. And share it as well with your networks. I want to thank my colleagues, Debbie Walsh, our director, Jean Sinstek, our associate director, Kira Semba-Matsu, senior scholar at the Center, for all being integral to that research, as well as Tu Nguyen, who both helped us organize today's conversation and made sure that we were able to get all of those voices and interviews included in the research. And thank you to Kai Barrios, a member of our staff as well, who is helping to make sure everything runs smoothly in today's webinar. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to have 2 women political leaders, each of whom spoke with me for this research, who can share their own first-person insights on how they have navigated and experienced politics to attain and exercise power, and more specifically, how we might disrupt some established thinking to engage in interventions that increase political power of all types and at diverse sites for all women. I do want to make a note that Assemblywoman Selena Torres was meant to join us today, but unfortunately, as is all too real, she's dealing with the shooting that is in Las Vegas currently. So she is okay, but of course she has to be there for both her students as an educator and at her constituents. And so we pray for everybody there and for their health, their safety, and also that this doesn't continue to happen. As the elected women who are with us today know, this is all too common. So let me, please join me in welcoming the elected representatives that are with us today. U.S. Representative Lauren Underwood, who currently represents Illinois' 14th Congressional District and was first sworn in to Congress in 2019. She's the first woman, the first person of color, and the first millennial to represent her community in Congress. Representative Underwood is a registered nurse and a co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, which addresses America's Black maternal health crisis. And Commissioner Leslie Osborn was elected as Oklahoma's 20th Labor Commissioner in 2018 and re-elected in 2022. Prior to being elected Labor Commissioner, she served 10 years in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and during that time, she was appointed as chair of the House Judiciary Committee, the first woman in state history to do so. Those are just very brief overviews of more extensive and impressive resumes, but they serve as a reminder of how lucky we are to be joined by these women today. And so I want to thank you both for being here, and even more, thank you for your leadership, your role modeling, your public service. And I want to get to the conversation and to the audience. And just to the audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A during the discussion that we'll have, and then we'll leave time at the end. And I want to also just note that Congresswoman Underwood also has a job to do, so there will be votes, and at some point she'll have to peek out, but we appreciate her staying for as long as she can. So I want to get started on the conversation and really dig in on this question of power, because we framed this whole report around this idea of power. And as I think both of you know, CAWP is really known for the numbers. And we talk about the numbers of women in office, the percentages of women in a body. So we often think about power in terms of those numbers, but we know it goes beyond that. And so part of what we hope to do is motivate discussions and interventions that are about increasing power in ways that maybe think more broadly about that. So that necessitates defining what do we mean by political power? So I'm going to pose it to you both. How would you define and or measure political power for women, whether in your states specifically or nationwide or both? And I'll start with Representative Underwood.
Thank you, Kelly. Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you. And Commissioner, it's so nice to meet you. I consider, women's political power to be when women can make decisions beyond having agency around your own life. And I think it's really important that we talk about influence, we talk about advising, we talk about being in the room, but there at some point is a decision maker, and it's very important that we sit at those decision-making tables and have a vote or the ability to sign a document and move forward in making that decision. I think that that is essential as part of that definition. I also think agenda setting is a very important part of the power conversation. And then, also defining the scope of a topic or an inquiry, right? So it's not enough, I think, for someone else to set that agenda and then you end up saying yes or no between very narrowly defined options. I think it's very important for women to be part of defining, the options that a decision will ultimately be made within those different criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. Commissioner Osborn, what do you think?
Well, obviously I'm in Oklahoma, which is a deep red state. And when I was elected to the legislature 15 years ago, out of 149 members of the House and Senate, I was the 11th woman. And my belief is that until your legislature actually meets your demographic as far as Black, white, gay, straight, female, male, we will never have true representation. It's getting better slowly. I think we're up to almost 30 out of 149. But it just shows how slow our progress is in a deep red state to elect women. And I think there are some things we can do to do that. But to me, women's power, I mean, we have to have a voice. We do have different viewpoints than men. We are generally the ones that have children. We're the ones that have to deal oftentimes with daycare deserts to whatever else, things that affect workforce, like what I do now. And it's we've got to have a more equal representation of the genders across the state, across the nation, to actually be able to promote things that help us empower the next generation of women that come in.
For sure. And I think both of you have touched on, I love all of these kind of where you make decisions, where agendas are set, right? Where voices can be heard. And I think that's, as a follow-up question, so much of this then is where are the sites of political power, and you both sit in positions of political power, right? And probably positions that are more recognized, right? Sitting in Congress, sitting as a commissioner of a state agency. But are there other sites that, especially for folks in this audience who are like, yeah, we want to help, where are the places, where this power is exercised that maybe we don't pay enough attention to, or that you think are especially important in this moment or in your states? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that, we know that we have a two-party, predominantly political system. However, there are nonpartisan offices. All political power is not decided through elections. Some of it is very much about relationships. Some of the most powerful people hold no official governmental position, and yet they are the singular gatekeepers. And that is very important to the dynamic, because oftentimes when we even hear the word gatekeeper, that is not usually a woman that we think of in that role. And so, I think that we have to be expansive when we think about pipelines, when we think about training, when we think about giving opportunities to both the traditional kind of structured power positions where there are regulations and rules, and then the informal places that hold tremendous power and sway, where it's based on respect and relationships and tradition in a different kind of a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Commissioner Osborn.
And I think that, in a state like mine, I feel like it's not that women can't win. It's often that women don't run And I think it's because we're more of a patriarchal state, and that we tend to think of when someone says, oh, who's going to be the next state rep? They name 2 or 3 businessmen from that area. It's not their natural inclination to think gender diverse, right? And I think that's incumbent upon us to be out there and be vocal. I know there's a group in Oklahoma that it's NEW leadership that is involved with many of our college and university systems. And I speak to those groups several times a year, but it's women that are interested in public service. And how would I even do that? And you learn the basics, the primer, of, hey, it might be easier to start with a school board or a city council seat, or like the Congresswoman said, perhaps even being appointed to something and being involved with a group. But I do think that it is incumbent upon us that are here to be reaching down and empowering other women, because it is more of an anomaly, and I think that it is incumbent upon us. I think those kind of organizations are very helpful. And in a state like this, I see a lot of the youth groups that will breed that will be the FFA and the FCLA, FCCLA, and all these. Their leadership roles sometimes gives them a taste that perhaps that is something I could do. But I think the main thing is just getting across to young women. Well, not even just young women. I didn't run till I was 45. And I'd never given a speech, never been political, but was very civic minded and kept up with politics. Is that it's not too late. Here's where you could start. Don't just be the one that knows this, be the voice, be the one. And I think that takes encouragement sometimes. And we do need to have a better way to network with women that have not gotten involved that would be spectacular in these roles.
I think that role modeling comes up so much in obviously what we do. And I want to reiterate that shout out to New Leadership, which is also part of a national network. So if you're not familiar, it's through CAWP, and New Leadership National Network. Also have relationships in other states to do that, to demystify kind of what politics is, who can serve, who can be in office. And I think it raises this important, a bit of a contrast, right? Representative Underwood, you came in as being seen as young, right? Young for being in office, especially in Congress. And so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, in your own path to Congress, I think there's a lot of valuable insights on some of these barriers, some of these challenges, as well as opportunities that you capitalized on. So kind of what did you learn through campaigning and since then about both hurdles and opportunities to women and other groups that maybe aren't deemed as those types of insiders that you already referenced in your previous answer?
So I am the Congresswoman for the 14th Congressional District of Illinois. It's a suburban and rural community outside of Chicago. I grew up in this community, and I am the youngest Black woman to ever serve in the Congress, but I'm also the first woman, the first person of color, and the youngest person to represent this community in the Congress. And so when I was running, it was so absurd for so many people to even think that I could win because I was first or going to be the youngest in so many different categories, right? Like, no one had seen anybody like me before. And so they didn't have an idea that it could even be possible. And so it wasn't necessarily any one hurdle that I faced. It's like this intersection. But my age, I decided to run for Congress when I was 30 years old. I got elected at 32. And my gender, being a woman, and so many people in my community, their idea of a leader was never a woman, much less a young woman, much less a young woman of color. My district, when I first ran, was less than 3% Black, right? So I was running against a white male incumbent member of Congress. And then, my primary opponents, I had 6 guys that were in a primary. They were all, older white men. And so, it's just a lot. So what I would say, I had an advantage in that I was different. It was novel. As soon as I launched the campaign, I got a lot of coverage, national coverage, local coverage. And so there is, an advantage in being new and shiny and different and bold and, all of those different things. But I think, raising money was hard. Getting endorsements from, these kind of institutional leaders like labor was hard, and in a blue state like mine, that matters, even when I was seeking to flip a seat. And so, I would just say that I learned in expressing myself to center shared values.
Yeah.
And, I can share my bio. I can help people understand how I got to where I, felt confident in running for office, making sure to always credential myself. Healthcare was the #1 issue in my election in 2018. I'm a registered nurse. I had worked on the Affordable Care Act. I had worked for a healthcare company. I'm a patient with a pre-existing condition, right? Like, I talked about that over and over and over again so that people knew that I was the singular expert, regardless of party, in that election, right? But that was up to me to credential myself. Nobody was going to do that for me. And so all those things I think are very important. And then since I've been in office, making sure that, we don't really go for parity, right? Like, I have a lot of female staff. I have women in very senior positions in my office. And then how we handle endorsements and support and building out a political organization kind of reflects that same point of view, and making sure that we're supporting women and women of color.
One thing I just want to follow up on, I think Commissioner Osborn's point at the beginning of that kind of exchange about, like, sometimes it's just getting women to say, like, yeah, I'll do it because it's tough. And I feel like you had to have been looking at this contest and saying, like, yeah, there are all these things that could be barriers. But I guess what also at that point made you go, but yeah, I'm doing it. Like, I'm going to do this. I can win. And it's worth it.
Yeah, so I have a pre-existing condition. I have a heart condition. I had spent my early career working to implement the Affordable Care Act, which guaranteed coverage for people like me with pre-existing conditions. And in the spring of 2017, I was on Marketplace, like on a Marketplace plan. And I just happened to go to a town hall meeting that my congressman was hosting during the time of Obamacare repeal. So you may remember spring of 17, President Trump had just taken office, and they were looking at making big changes to our healthcare system. And so my congressman stood in front of my community and said he was only going to support a version of repeal that let people with pre-existing conditions keep their healthcare coverage. And I said, okay, great, right? Like, we don't agree on everything, but that's really important. And I believed him. And then 2 weeks later, he broke his word. And he voted for a version of Obamacare repeal that did the opposite. It made it cost prohibitive for people like me to get affordable coverage. And I got mad. And I was like, you know what? It's on, I'm running. And like, literally, I couldn't let it go. I spent that summer figuring out how to run for office, and me and a good girlfriend built a website, and we shot a launch video, and we just like did it. But it was an issue that I cared about, and I didn't like how he was kind of cavalier with something so important like healthcare.
Yeah. And I think some of it, and you've told this story before, and I want to pitch this too to Commissioner Osborn as well, which is, I know Representative Underwood, you talked about going to different trainings and just being like, I'm going to do everything. You were great when we were talking about this earlier for the actual research report. But it does speak to this broader question of, is there support? Is there enough support? And in the report, we talk about it as support infrastructure. And it's not just trainings, but it's financial. It's, it's expensive to run. It's an opportunity cost to serve often. And so I guess, what else do you think is still necessary to build out supports that could allow for more inclusion, not just in terms of gender, but race, ethnicity, class, age, all of the types of diversity you all point to as important? How do you build a support infrastructure within these political ecosystems that allows for and encourages people from all of those groups to run and to serve? So I wonder if you want to start, Commissioner Osborn, with what you think is needed.
I think that it's incumbent upon women that have been successful in this field to pay it forward. So my favorite group that I speak to every year, so it's been 5 years since I've been a statewide elected, is the American Legions. What is it? The Boys State and Girls State. I speak in Girls State. The girls that are at Girls State are very diverse. They're from all across the state. And I always try to encourage for them to think outside of their box, because many of them are from those small communities where they've only seen men in leadership. But they've reached this point where they're getting ready to go to college, they're leaders in their small schools, and I want to plant the seed with them in this next generation that it is possible. And that there's a lot right now that is so distressing when we turn on the news, but a good woman in the room, as we always say, if you want a job done and you want it really done well, call a woman. I mean, we've heard this forever, but we're detail oriented, we're empathetic, we're hard workers. Of course, not everybody, but in general. And when I plant those seeds every year, I have girls come up to me afterwards and say, I never really thought that I could be the one, that I could do that. So I grew up in Indiana, even though I live in Oklahoma, and our kind of mascot for our state was Johnny Appleseed. Big believer in arbor and planting seeds. So I always say I'm the Joni Appleseed of Oklahoma. And I think it's incumbent upon me to not get too busy and self-involved and important, that I don't have the time to be pulling other young women up the ladder. And I think that it's breaking that barrier of it's even possible. Now in Oklahoma, surprisingly, even though very few women run, they have a very good percentage of winning, Democrat and Republican. So it's not that the voters won't support them, it's them having the confidence. And then the other thing that is a barrier with a lot of the younger women here is we have huge childcare deserts in Oklahoma, and that affects everything, from whether you work in fast food to state government. And so a lot of times I will hear women say, well, maybe after my kids are grown. But we would never hear a man say that. And it, that's where I really work to reframe those conversations. I'm not saying the minute you have the baby, you head straight to work and leave him in the incubator. But I'm saying you have to think outside of that box. And if you're going to be in a career, why would you think this is any different than working as a loan officer? And I think, but once again, I think we have to be the ones that help spread that narrative of this is possible. And then the last thing I'd say on this is so many groups I speak to tell me that when a female comes to speak to them, they always feel like it's more authentic. They aren't hearing the talking points that you hear, oh, well, let's hit off A, B, C, D, and E. They say, when you talk to me, I feel like this is what's really going on. I'm not hearing silly talking points. I'm hearing about the things that matter. You're shooting me straight. And in general, I get that from so many audiences. They feel like it's more that way when women come speak to them. And that's where it's our job then to make sure we're pulling up more women, and these percentages get better as we age.
Yeah.
So I have a few thoughts, if I can just share.
Absolutely.
I was writing them down as soon as you asked the question, because, Commissioner Osborn's so right about like the pipeline programs, and to make sure that particularly our programs for like middle school girls, high school girls include not just a leadership component, because I think that we do pretty well with that these days, but about, preparing to be an executive decision maker is very important. We do a lot with girls around collaboration. We do a lot with girls around, competing, even academically or in sports and things like that, and like what it is to be a leader of a team, but not necessarily around executive leadership, which I think is very, very important for this conversation. I think of the political training programs, I've taken so many of them available to Democratic women, I'll say, but a lot of them focus on, seeing yourself as a leader, seeing yourself as a candidate, doing that like pep talk so that you can see yourself as a leader with confidence. But running for office and winning your election are two different things. And there's not as many trainings that prepare you to win, that prepare you to serve once you win, to prepare you to serve with distinction so that you can get reelected, right? Like those are all like very different things. And we have to be able to be successful along that continuum. Being there, similarly, a lot of the trainings do not give you the tools to win in a competitive environment. They give you the tools to win in what would be casually called like a safe seat. So like how to compete in a primary, maybe even, and win. Even if that's a competitive primary, we're not seeing a lot of training programs, in my opinion, around communicating to that broadest swath of your community. At least not beyond like a county or school board seat, which are just different because you're not generally doing paid communications. And once you open up that paid communications conversation, I find a lot of people just are not prepared as an executive leader to manage a budget of that size to advance their own goals and win their election. I had talked, I'm just rushing through this because I'm going to have to drop off very shortly.
Yeah, no worries.
But in the report, I think you included it in the report, a conversation around pressure to what I call mortgage your future. And, you know, in running for Congress, running for Congress was the first position that I ran for. I just happened to win. And there's a lot of pressure to sign away your future on these contracts, right? With your TV company, the media company, or, you know, there's large sums of money. And at the end of the day, I, as the candidate, ultimately responsible for the financial decisions that, and many times my staff or an advisor is making on my behalf. I was unwilling at 30 years old to mortgage my future for my campaign. And so, you know, that really was a limitation because I was not personally wealthy. My family's not wealthy, and we weren't able to self-fund much of anything related to the campaign. And I think that if we're going to have a serious conversation around women gaining political power in every space that is powerful, we have to be much more direct about changing expectations around money. And then the last thing I'll say is when we talk about women in power, picking what position you seek is so important. Because we need women in every seat of power, we're sort of like, well, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And then we have this pileup of women in positions that on the realm of consequence may not be the most consequential. And then the one woman that goes for that important, powerful position, if she's not successful, it kind of ruins it because it discourages other people from seeking that position. People think that maybe women aren't up for it. And it, you know what I mean? It's just dangerous. We need to be more explicit about pathways and opportunities and trainings to get women into every position where decisions are made. Judges, you know, is just an example to me where we just don't have that kind of common conversation around how to get to those positions.
We spoke with Deborah Gonzalez in Georgia, who's the district attorney. And, you know, she said, I was begging for groups to get me support. She's like, so there were these women's groups, but they didn't serve DAs. Like they weren't involved in those campaigns. They wouldn't give money to those races. And she wasn't kind of, you know, bad mouthing them. She's just saying like, we need them too, you know, like we need this type of support. And I think to your other point, Congresswoman, this piece about so many people said, well, where's also the support to train and support women about how to exercise power and retain authenticity and autonomy once you're there, which is also a whole nother challenge that I know you can't cover in the next minute before you have to leave, but you know, is an issue I think for every woman. And I'll pose this, of course, to Commissioner Osborn, who's experienced the challenge of the party system and party dynamics in Oklahoma between the legislature and, you know, being in executive office, right? And sort of balancing that as how can you exercise the power in a place that is most effective for you to move the needle on the issues you care about.
So when I was in the House of Representatives, I was the appropriations chair on the year that we had the worst budget crisis in state history. And as a very moderate Republican, my speaker asked me to find out how we'd gotten in such a mess, a $1.1 billion shortfall with a balanced budget state. And I spent 3 months out of session at the Tax Commission, and after a lengthy study, discovered that trickle-down economics was a lie and that it had never been what we were told it was. But most people, it's like, I was born Methodist, I'm a Methodist. I was born a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. Later, we learned to discern, ask questions, check out. So I went back to my party's leadership. I said, well, obviously we cut taxes too many times. We're bleeding out. We can't take care of foster children. People are going to die on our watch. We have to raise taxes. Well, obviously not popular for a Republican, but he went along with me for a while. And then the movement got so strong, he started getting the calls from all the big donors that didn't want to pay more taxes, even if someone was going to die in the street. And I had to make the decision, this will hurt my career. I'll probably be removed. And I stayed the course to my true north. I was publicly fired from that position of power, front page of the 2 Oklahoma newspapers, main ones, Osborn fired and shamed. But I'm one of those people that believes the true north is more important than the goal. And I think 2 other people that feel that way are Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. And we're seeing that right now on the national stage. And I think that's another thing that it's incumbent upon us of the young women we want to mentor to come up, is that we can't sell out. Once you sell out from what your true north was, it's easier the second time and the third time and the fourth time you don't recognize the person in the mirror. And that happens to so many people we elect, and it's vexing, and I don't understand it, but it happens. So it's a constant guarding of what you stand for. At the end of the day, I left 2 years early from our term limits, ran for a statewide office, and I now outrank the Speaker of the House. So where a door closes, there is often a window that will open. And even if you are the one that doesn't find the window immediately, please, for the love of God, stay the course on what is your true north. And one other thing I forgot to say earlier is another good way to get involved is to help with a campaign. And I'm sure the Congresswoman had a lot of strong young people that want to get out and knock doors or do whatever. That's a great way for them to familiarize themselves of what it takes to win.
Yeah.
So I would encourage anyone thinking about running that is on this webinar to reach out to someone they know that is elected and see if you can meet with them, have coffee with them, pick their brain, help them with their next campaign, and use that as your tutelage.
I know, Congresswoman, I think you're probably looking at your lights and in your emails. If you need to go, I just want to give you a space before you have to sign off to share anything else. I mean, we could talk for days. I could pick your brain for days. But to this audience of people who came, interested in this topic, anything else that you think is important we communicate as we think about kind of the future of women and political power?
Let's just make decisions and then continue to make decisions in order to change the system as we know it. It's not any singular thing that we need to change. There's so many small changes that can be made to create additional opportunities and space and to support women in power and to reshape the conversation around likability, around success, around achievement, around, expectations even, so that we can facilitate that female leader to get her to icon status. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's available. It's just, we don't have people choosing to frame women's leadership and women's power in that way. So I'm really excited. Congratulations, Kelly and team, for this great report. And I look forward to seeing where we go from here. Thank you. And congratulations again, Commissioner Osborn. Nice to see you.
And thank you again for being here. And to the folks, to our audience, we're still here. And thank you to the commissioner for sticking around too. And we're going to continue the conversation. And I see that there's some questions in the Q&A. So I'll just give everybody another kind of minute. I'll ask one more question of Commissioner Osborn, and then I'll go to that Q&A from the audience. And so one thing we didn't get a chance to cover is, you talked about partisanship and party challenges, but I want to talk more broadly, I guess, about that. What we found in the report too is that part of the challenge is that the parties are different in the way that they approach the conversation about gender or identity in politics, and that even defining women's underrepresentation as a problem can be more challenging within a more conservative or Republican environment. Sometimes folks will say, right, like, we don't want to talk about it in terms of demographics. And so I think it leads to these questions about how do we better engage Republican or conservative audiences, leaders, in a conversation that's about increasing women's political power without maybe turning them off by using some of the language around like gender targeted strategies. So I'm just curious, both your general thoughts, but if you have any ideas as well about how we do better.
Well, it's obviously kind of one of the first messages you learn in this or anything else probably with public speaking is know your audience, right? So when I speak to chambers and rotaries and groups across the state about workforce and a lot of the things we do at labor, I have more leeway than when I go and speak to a Republican group, right? So, I mean, I don't change the story. I don't tell them different things, but I have different things I focus on. So for instance, to a Republican group, because we have some of the most draconian abortion laws in the nation. After the overturn of Roe v. Wade, we went back to a 1910 law. And that immediately triggered in. So one of the things that I noticed, for instance, that's a huge topic right now. And in a deeply red fundamentalist evangelical state, it's getting across that we're not being pro-abortion if we talk about women having safe reproductive health. So it's the reframing. And I had to learn that when I was appropriations chair. Good Lord, I never asked for new taxes. I asked for us to invest in ourselves. Right? But messaging matters. It does. And this is not just a gimmick. This is not a spin. It's marketing 101. If you want to be successful in business, you learn this already. But the same way, it's framing things. And when you talk to an audience, everyone in that audience will know somebody that had a difficult pregnancy or an unviable pregnancy, or those kinds of things. So you focus on, do you realize because of these laws that we are losing all of our OBGYNs in rural areas? They're scared to treat because of felonious possibilities for saving a woman's life. So you say to the audience, so are you okay knowing that everyone in Oklahoma will have to go to Oklahoma City or Tulsa to get their care? And that's not safe. And when you frame it in those ways and even make it about commerce, if you want to bring, businesses to rural Oklahoma, this is going to be a factor, right? Okay, that's reframing, that's marketing. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that being part of this job, right? But it is. And it's learning a way to frame things that don't sound incendiary, because so many things politically are. I mean, good Lord, I've never seen it so polarized. In fact, it's almost dangerous. And I'd love to tell you a real quick story that encapsulates that. I gave the commencement speech at our largest career tech graduation in May. And it was thousands of people. It filled an entire ORU basketball stadium. And I just gave the typical, the world is your oyster and you can do this. But I also always end with a call for civility, bipartisanship, getting along, looking at bigger pictures, right? Two emails in my inbox the next morning. So I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. The first is a father who said, my son graduated last night and we feel like he can be anything he wants because of your speech. You gave us hope and thank you so much. So of course I write the beautiful, thank you so much for the kind words.
Yeah.
And I open the next one and it starts with B, blank, 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 blank. That was the most horrifying speech I ever heard. You're obviously not a real Republican. I hope you die. Okay. Same audience, same message, shows the polarization of America. I'm not going to change calling for civility. And if that inflames somebody, fine. But it is an example of know your audience and be able to market what you need or what you think is what your constituency needs or what your beliefs are into a way that is more palatable to them is, I think, one of the hugest keys of being successful once you get there or being successful in running.
Yeah. Have you found when you're speaking with folks, again, different audiences, but again, more conservative audiences, about what you obviously care about, which is, getting women into positions of power, et cetera. have you found effective ways to have those conversations with those communities? I think, if you don't mind me sharing, well, it's in the report, but you shared a story about, dealing with kind of older male donors who kind of weren't thinking of you in positions of power, like governor or something like that, right? Like that you have to navigate sometimes folks who aren't really thinking in that way about gender and gender progress. And how do you navigate that in a way that does continue to move the needle so that we can make, changes that push more women to want to run for office or to be successful once they're there, to be at the right tables and in the right rooms? How do you push that needle with folks who maybe are a little less comfortable with that conversation?
So that's a great question. And the real quick, what that was an older gentleman who's always supported me in all of my campaigns. I've been elected 7 times. And in the last one, it was a statewide. He said, I hope I get to write a check for your last campaign. And I said, well, what will my last campaign be? He says, well, when you run for lieutenant governor.
Right.
And I said, well, Mr. So-and-so, why did you think it wouldn't be governor? And he kind of chuckled. And he says, well, you're wonderful, but you're a girl. Okay, well, first of all, at 60, that's a compliment to still just be called a girl. But you have to understand the demographic voting in your race. Okay, so in Oklahoma, closed primaries, who's going to show up in closed primaries, particularly in special elections or runoffs, is predominantly elderly, white constituency, probably very religious, whatever. That means I have to market different to that. So it's once again knowing your demographic. Now, I sat down with that lovely gentleman and told him, you know what, I might just want to be governor someday. And once he kind of went past the aha, he said, okay, tell me what you'd want to do.
Yeah.
So it's not letting that be offensive. It's realizing where they're coming from. When he was born, you never saw a woman in these positions, right? So I have to give that some grace.
Yeah.
But I can also help change the narrative. And I think that though the biggest hope for me is to catch these young, these girls, state girls, these college girls, these young, we're raising a wonderful generation. And even though I'm a Republican, my biggest chagrin is that my mother had more rights than my daughter. Mm-hmm. And I do believe you can be anti-abortion and pro-choice, not to get into a lot, but we're talking about framing and about having more women represent so that we realize this is about women's safety in the reproductive world. It's not about the other things. And that's that reframing. And that's why it is so important what you all are doing, this project you're doing, for all of us to be the ones that reach down the ladder and pull somebody up. So if there is somebody on this webinar that wants to reach out, I'd love you to put my work email on there. And I would talk to anyone, anywhere about what might be a good pathway or a way to start or to step in if they were interested. Because there's a lot of people out there that just need that gentle boost and someone that believes in them. And I think that most of us have that if we'll look in our circle.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And I'm sure many folks, you may get more emails than you're expecting.
So it may take a week to get to them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'll do it.
So let me do what I said I would do and go to some of the Q&A, which is one of the first questions from Karen Weinstein said, many decisions are made through informal discussion. How do women find and become involved in those discussions?
Okay, so you're going to think this is a little weird, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. When I get elected, I'm the only one that comes in that year as a woman with a bunch of guys. I quickly realized that the women that were already serving didn't hang out with the men. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there was a group that got together once or twice a week. They had a box of hymnals and they would have like a singing night. I elected to go out with the guys for a beer after work, okay? Because the men, after work, when they went out for a beer, were deciding the things that were going to be decided on the floor the next day. Because the real work doesn't get done on the House floor. It gets done over sharing a beer at the meeting. And it's like, hey, I saw you have this, and I think we could insert that. And I quickly learned that if I wanted to be successful, I needed to go where the power was. It wasn't that I was trying to infiltrate the men or that I was denigrating the women, but it paid off. It's kind of what my mother taught me a gazillion years ago: dress for success. Go where the people in power are and work with them. and it matters. And because I did that different thing, I was the first woman to be Judiciary Chair and the first Republican woman to be Appropriations Chair. And I think it was because I picked that pathway.
And I'd like to just follow up on that as a great example on 2 points. One is that it's a really great reminder, again, of what we try to focus on in this report, which is to say there are all these other sites of power. And sometimes there are these informal tables, if you will. But there are also places where, and I don't know if this is true in your current office or in the legislature, but there are going to be unelected folks who sit in those rooms and tables who also maybe have an influence. Sometimes it's lobbyists, sometimes it's staff people. But these are other places where we both have to identify influence and also find ways to get in there, to be at that table or to be in that room. And so that came up a lot.
I think the huge thing on that is networking. And
Yeah.
so I have always tried to at least 2 or 3 times a week slip in a coffee meeting or a lunch or an afternoon coffee meeting before I leave or whatever with somebody that is in a periphery of what we're working on. So like right now we're doing a lot with workforce. So last week I called somebody that at Goodwill Industries is working on things with second chance offenders. And every time I meet with somebody that's in my contacts list, that's in my periphery, I've added one more spoke to something that I can be involved with or get them involved with that all comes together and works well. When I was in the legislature, I consciously tried every time I had serious legislation that wasn't just some statutory cleanup to find at least one member of the opposition party to sign on as a co-author.
Yeah.
Because I knew then it would give them skin in the game. And almost everything I worked on was not social issues that were more, divided or bifurcated. It was going to be the things that served that 70% of people in the middle that just want good government. So a lot of people are like, well, I'll just get a bunch of people in my party. No, how about if we do the olive branch and work with somebody who's of like mine, but a different party? It helps immensely by making those connections. And there may have been some change that somebody recommended that I wouldn't have thought of that made it more palatable for the entire body. I'm a huge believer in that networking. And sometimes you have to be the one that reaches out for those 1 or 2. It's like, okay, next week, who are the 1 or 2 people I haven't thought of in a while that I could connect with?
Absolutely. A couple of questions came in about kind of reforms that could help here in, again, creating space and opportunity for women in office. So one more specifically about, change in regard to campaign funding. Would that be helpful, or what you think might need to be done? And then a more broad question about election reforms. Are there other broad election reforms that would be helpful in getting more women to both run and be successful?
So on both of those, we're in a bad place. If you remember, I always called myself a John McCain Republican because he was a maverick that would go against his own party if it was what he believed. But John McCain, every year, there was a bill called McCain-Feingold. And you may be too young, but it was filed every year. And it was about campaign finance reform with a Democrat and a Republican running it together. They got so close to the finish line so many times and never got it across. Because of the U.S. Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, we have absolutely blown apart fair funding. We are now living in the time where often the biggest races can only be won by wealthy white males who can self-fund because now it's allowable. I don't think that was the intent of the founding fathers. And I wish I could tell you there was a fix for that. But overall, because that is a federal decision from SCOTUS, it affects every race down to school boards in Gotebo, Oklahoma. So I love to use that one because if you're not from Oklahoma, you're like, what the heck? There is a Gotebo. There's also a Henny Pen. So that being said, the main thing you're going to have to deal with is that if you are thinking about running it's daunting to raise the money, but it's doable when you have the right message. When you can explain what your true north is to somebody you're across from, you can raise the money. But as far as campaign finance, it's that federal decision is made it very difficult. Second thing, election reform. I am a big proponent of open primaries, and I think that's a bipartisan issue. But in the states that are open primaries, we're a closed primary state. For instance, we are dominantly red in Oklahoma. If you're a Democrat or an independent, you get a different ballot. 80% of the decisions will be decided in the Republican primary. And we have disenfranchised every Democrat and Republican to only get to have a voice in 20% of the elections. That's not right. I don't think that was also the founding fathers' intent. So I do think it's incumbent upon us to every once in a while say, well, just because this is the system we've always had, is there one that would drive better voter participation?
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the greatest blessings of living in a democratic society or republic is that the freedom to vote. And so many countries don't have that freedom. So we should always be looking at gerrymandering. We should always be looking at election ballot access. Anything, we always need to be saying, not can I get the people out that'll vote for me, but how do we get more people involved in voting no matter who they're going to support? And I think that's where we have to step back and take ourselves and our parties out of it. It really does need to be about the highest participation.
And related to that, one interesting thing that came up in our research, we chose three states that had term limits. And so we had a mix of states that had term limits and not in this study. And that came up as well as like, is that a way to open up, right, to give greater access to more people? And across the board, folks said to us, well, it's a little bit of both, right? Because then we have really experienced women in office who get termed out, right? And so it's just a reminder to us that any of these structural solutions or reforms that we have to really think through both the short and long-term benefits, challenges, and as you noted, the political challenges even to get to that reform.
Absolutely. I voted in Oklahoma, that was on the ballot by initiative petition before I ever ran. And I voted for it because they used as an example somebody in southeastern Oklahoma that had been very corrupt and had been in the Senate for 40 years. But he was an anomaly. I didn't realize that because I wasn't political. So I voted for it, got it in, and it's been fine. But I will be termed in 3 years from this. I would have been termed in the House in 2 more years. People tend to term themselves. We have as much turnover from people that move on to something else or go back to what they were doing as the term limits. But we do lose a lot of the good people. And in Oklahoma, for instance, we have an extremely complicated budgetary process. It can take years to truly understand all the things we do that are funding sources. It's very convoluted. So by the time you start to figure it out, you've termed out and we got the next baby freshman in who doesn't know what the hell it is. So now I am not in favor of term limits, or if so, much longer term limits. I do think it would be a beautiful thing in DC, but no state can do that. It would have to be national or you would be hurting yourself. And that's where, but the same way, none of us want to see the guy that's been in there 52 years. But on the other hand, I'm not sure they need to leave at 12. And so it's a tough question. Like you said, be real careful about what you put in your constitution, because that's real hard to pull back.
Right. Well, of course, there's never enough time. So we've got a few minutes left, and of course, a million other things we could talk about. And I appreciate some other more comments in the Q&A just about agreeing with what you and Congresswoman Underwood shared, and to thank you. And talk again here about the importance of, some partisan differences in terms of how you talk about this issue and engage the most amount of people in this work to increase women's political power. So I want to give you again the last, like I did with Congresswoman Underwood, a kind of last word on that. And I'll just remind you, because it was a long time ago when we first spoke, but I ended all of the interviews for this project asking the question of kind of, when you think about women and political power, what do you foresee for the future? What gives you hope and what gives you any pause for concern? And I'll ask that again here for a broader audience.
So the biggest cause for concern is the people that run that don't understand how it really works, and not understanding the role of government. Because to me, the role of government is to provide the resources that allow a society to function and its citizens to flourish. You have to have a system of infrastructure in driving, in roads and bridges, you do in education, you do in mental health. We have so many people that come in and want to reframe what that is. They want to save our souls, or only run social issue bills. Know what you're running for and what their true purpose is very important. And then I think that we have to focus on empowering women and being the one that plants those seeds, speaking to young civic groups, but then, like I said, I didn't run till I was 45. So don't just say we need all ages, just like we need all races and all genders. So, when I go see somebody like that and they say, oh, well, I'm too old. And it's like, remember, I never gave a speech till I was 45. I had my own business for 22 years selling agricultural sales products because I grew up on a farm. And never say I can't. But I do think it is incumbent upon us to network and to reach out, because it is a little harder. We don't have that natural inclination to be who people look to for as the leaders. But when we are the leaders, we're usually highly successful. So we've got to do more of the networking and pulling people up with us. And I just put in the chat my email address that comes directly to me. And yes, you may share it with the general audience. If no one's interested, great. But if not, I'd love to hear from anyone.
That is so great. Thank you so much. And I want to follow up briefly on what you just said and just add that so much of the work that is done to increase women's political power is by women and for women. And that's so valuable. And these networks are incredibly important. But I will say one of the prescriptions we have as well is to expand that pool of people that are working on this, including the men who are already oftentimes in positions of power, and make sure they're doing this work with us. And so I would encourage that as well, because you all have multiple jobs and wear multiple hats. And so much of what we learned in doing this research was that so much of the infrastructure is built on women who are doing 5 jobs, and many of them for free. And this is not new to women, but we want to make sure that we also are expanding and strengthening the infrastructure so that it doesn't all fall on women like you. But we do so much appreciate it, and appreciate you being here and taking more time to talk with us and to support our work. It's just so valuable for folks to hear directly from those who are doing it, who, as we say, walk the walk. And I want to thank you to the audience as well for joining us. And please remember to check out our report. It's a handy microsite. It centers the voices of women like Commissioner Osborn and Representative Underwood, and you can get first-person insights from other political women as well, and in addition to some of our prescriptions for how we move the needle forward. And please share the report with your networks and continue the conversation. Reach out to us, reach out to the commissioner, and thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you again, Commissioner Osborn, and I hope you all have a great evening.